The next mindset in Operation Hasten is encouraging the burden bearers. The first story that comes to mind is in Exodus 17, where we read how Moses was holding up his hands and that while his hands were up, the battle was being won. But when he put his hands down, the battle was lost. But his hands were heavy, it says. And so we find that Aaron and Hur, they took a stone, they put a chair underneath him, and he sat there, and then they were on each side of him and holding up his hands. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. This story shows the importance of supporting the burden bearers. Right? Moses was chosen by God to lead the people and intercede on their behalf, but even Moses grew weary. It was Aaron and Hur who provided the strength and encouragement needed for the victory to be secured. And so we too are called to be like Aaron and Hur, lifting up the hands of the burden bearers around us. Story of Nehemiah comes to mind next. This highlights here how half of the servants were building the wall, and the other half held the shields, also the spears and the bows. But I think it's important to point out the shields. So half of them were doing the work, and the others were shielding those doing the work. So oftentimes we don't even appreciate so much the idea of how the burden bearers need to be shielded by the attacks, by the bows coming in on them. We read, "They which build the wall, and they that bear the burdens, every one with his hands wrought in the work." So again, we read here that everybody was involved in this. The story of Nehemiah highlights that everybody has a role to play in the work of God. Some build, others guard, but together they accomplish the task. The principle applies today. Some bear the spiritual burdens, where others are called to provide support and protection, guarding the work, encouraging the workers. Without this unity, the wall would have never been built. Ellen White has many quotes on this. One that's very powerful says, "Many have borne so few burdens in their hearts. They have known so little real anguish. They have felt so little perplexity and distress on behalf of others that they cannot understand the work of the true burden bearer." And so what she's saying here is that there are some who are just so carefree, they're just thinking about themselves, they're going about the world, they like to do their little gossiping, and they have no idea what it takes to be a burden bearer. She goes on later how they will be removed, and we see here that bitter experience have given them knowledge. So the work of many a burden bearer is not understood. His labors are not appreciated until death dies him low. This is the story of James White, how the General Conference, how the early Advent leaders left everything on James's plate to do. And he ended up dying early. Ellen White said that it was a rebuke against the people of her time. And so after the burden bearers die or remove themselves, when others take up the burden he's laid down and are met with the same difficulties that they encountered, they all of a sudden understand, oh, I see how his faith was tested. I see how his courage was tested. And then those little mistakes that they were so quick to jump on and gossip about are lost sight of. Experience teaches them empathy. God permits them to be placed in positions of responsibility, and when they err, he has the power to correct and remove them. We should be careful not to take into our hands the work of judging that belongs to God. Right? We're reading here about this reminder to empathize and sympathize with those who are carrying the load for so long, recognizing that God is the judge, and recognizing that if we were to carry that burden for a little while, we would understand. We read in Testimonies of the Church, we read that we as a people are reaping the fruit of brother so-and-so's hard labor. And there is not a man among us who has devoted more time and thought to this work than the brother has. And he has felt that he had no one to sustain him. And he has felt grateful for any encouragement. No one has been more active in the work than this brother. There are many who are working tirelessly, and there's no greater joy than to encourage those who are experiencing that. Like this brother who felt alone in his efforts, the burden bearers need our support, recognition, gratitude for their faithfulness. It reminds me of the story of Elijah, how he's out in the cave and he just feels like he's the only one. Right? We need to be reminding people that there are many others that have not bowed the knee. And it just feels like we're all isolated. Those who are doing the work, the ministry work, are being attacked heavily because they put themselves out there. And those that are not doing anything, they're hiding back and they just gossip. And Proverbs reminds us that whoever fosters love covers an offense. This verse reminds us that in fostering love, we are to uplift and encourage one another, especially in the face of trials, especially when we see how, the burden bearers, they're the ones that are going to get the most temptations thrown at them. And rather than praying for them and lifting them up, it's like, oh, let's gossip about them when they fail. The more we cover each other's burdens with love, the more we reflect the character of Christ. And I shared this little context here earlier about this idea of the adoption curve. I really believe this applies to ministry, right? We can apply this adoption curve model to our burden bearers, right? That's the innovators. They're the ones pushing the boundaries, while the others, let's say the early adopters, they're the one taking those new ideas and taking them to market. Those are also burden bearers. Then there's those in the early majority who are following the trends but not leading in charge, right? These are the ones that are kind of sitting on the wagon in the last example we showed, right? Then we have the late majority, and then finally the laggards, and those ones that are actively resisting the change. As burden bearers, we must identify where we fit and ensure that we aren't hindering the progress, or support the burden bearers that are, if we're early majority or late majority, ensure we're supporting the next group above us. When we think about, as a tree, if we were to look at this as a tree, right, the innovators are the ones who face the most resistance, but they're the ones that are essential for growth and progress. We need innovators to create the branches, to create the trunk even. Right? They're the ones that are organizing events. They're the ones that are developing, systems, and they're the ones that are always out there trying to lead and trying to push and trying to take action. Are we supporting the innovators, or are we pulling them down? And the innovators need to be paired up with the early adopters. Those are the ones that are taking the challenge that the innovators have paved, right? And laying those challenges out and taking them and spreading them out. They're the branches off of the core trunk. They help move the work forward by providing the support needed to turn ideas into action. Where do you see yourself in this process? Are you willing to be an early adopter? Are you willing to shoulder this responsibility? And then we have the early majority, right? These typically wait and see if something will succeed before joining. If you find yourself here, are you stepping up when needed? Are you holding back, waiting for someone else to carry the burden? And then there's a late majority. And these follow only when it becomes obvious that it's going to happen and it's too obvious to ignore. We must ask ourselves, are we delaying the work of God by hesitating too long to join? And finally, we have the laggards. Those who are taking an axe to the base of the tree. Those who are taking an axe to the innovators and the early adopters. Those who are resisting change into the very end. It's critical to remember that in God's work, there is no room for those who block the path of progress. I think what's interesting is to understand and point out, as we read here, that haters don't really hate you. They hate themselves because you're a reflection of who they wish to be. And I think this is so true. It feels like there's so many people that have a feeling, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that. And when people actually start to do it, right? And by the way, this is a page out of my entrepreneurship course. This whole idea of the understanding that if you want to be an entrepreneur, you'll have to understand what it takes to be an innovator, an early adopter. And it's not easy. And so think about where you are and think about, who is above you in the chain that you should be supporting. So out of, let's say, 100 people, maybe 2 of them are innovators, right? But innovators are rarely associated with people that pull them down. So if you're an early adopter, you're probably going to know several innovators. But if you're back in the late majority, it's unlikely that even one of your 1,000 contacts are even innovators. So that's why you have to be thinking about, how can I support the group right above me? 1 Thessalonians says, encourage therefore one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. This is a call to action. We are not only to recognize those that are doing the work, but actively support them through prayer, encouragement, and participation. In Galatians, Paul urges us to bear with each other's burdens. And this isn't a suggestion, it's a direct call to action. It's fulfilling the law of Christ through love, patience, and support. Burden bearers often carry more than their share. And we're called to lighten their load by stepping in, offering help, encouraging them in the good work that they do. So as I close, I just asked you, are we truly appreciative of the burden bearers that surround us? Are we like Aaron and Hur, lifting up the hands of Moses? Are we like are we on the wall building the wall? Or are we holding shields to protect those that are building the wall? Are we willing to support, encourage, and uplift them in their labors of the kingdom of God? Let this be a wake-up call to us to understand the need for everyone's active participation. You can't just sit on your couch. You can't just go to church every Sabbath and expect to be fed. You got to make sure you're also feeding. In that analogy, it could be helping out. It could be, providing potluck. It could be whatever it is, but understanding that it just feels like so many go to church, they show up with an empty plate and, metaphorically and literally, and just want to be fed. We will never finish the work like this. There needs to be revival, and it needs to start with other-centeredness.